Today, we're going to unravel the tangled mess that is World War I, and specifically America's decision to participate in World War I. As we're going to talk about again and again, World War I is not like its sequel, World War II. There are a number of similarities between the two wars, but World War I was not a war that the United States had to enter. World War II, the causal explanation for why the United States goes to war is pretty simple. We get bombed, and Japan and Germany declare war on us. It kind of takes the choice or the agency out of it. But you're not really going to see a Pearl Harbor moment in the First World War. And the inescapable conclusion is that the United States chooses to go to war in 1917. And what's most surprising of all is that the President of the United States that makes that choice, Woodrow Wilson, says that it would, quote, be the irony of fate if my administration had to deal chiefly with foreign affairs. When Woodrow Wilson is elected in 1912, it's with a pretty clear domestic mandate. He campaigns on raiding and trust, on providing relief for American farmers, for basically doing everything but focusing chiefly on foreign affairs. But as a cautionary note to Mr. Wilson and to all of you, I would say that if history is a person, if it has personality traits, the only sure personality trait I can say with any definitiveness that it has is a profound sense of irony. So whenever you say, wouldn't it be funny if, be careful, because whether through karma or just a well-developed sense of ironic humor, it has a tendency of coming true. Wilson's administration will have to deal chiefly in foreign affairs, and it will change American foreign policy as well as world history forever. Now, this lecture is going to involve a fair amount of European history, but we're just going to sort of skim the surface. Obviously, from an American historical perspective, all we really have time for is just the bullet points. Though I will be making a video that goes over some of these causes in more detail from a European perspective. But the short explanation is that World War I breaks out basically in July of 1914 because of the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. Franz Ferdinand is the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And remember how we kind of talked about Spain as being sort of like this perpetually declining power, this empire that emerges in the pre-modern era during the 1415 and 1600s, which, yeah, does kind of span into the modern era, that basically reaches a peak early on and declines from that point forward. Well, the Austro-Hungarian Empire is very similar to that. It's an empire that really isn't a nation state in the truest sense of the term. Nation states are communities that are based around some kind of strong sense of national unity. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was a feudal creation. It was created by the Habsburg dynasty and consisted of dozens of different European and non-European nationalities. And many of those nationalities were clamoring for independence because of the outbreak of nationalism in 19th century Europe. One of those communities or nationalities were the Serbs. The Serbian people were chiefly concentrated in, you guessed it, the nation of Serbia, but they also existed beyond Serbia, especially in certain parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, especially provinces like Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now, many of these Serbians wanted to break away from the Austro-Hungarian Empire and join the nation-state of Serbia, because that's kind of what nationalism is all about. It's about basically forming a state or some kind of national community with other people that you share traits in common with, usually a common language, but also usually a common religion or or ethnic background. Again, nationalism is very diverse. It depends upon the type of nationalism you're looking at, but Serbs throughout the Austro-Hungarian Empire commonly wanted to break away from the empire and join the nation-state of Serbia. One radical organization that wanted to do that was, and I love this name, an organization called the Black Hand. The Black Hand sounds like something from Marvel Comics, admittedly, but it was basically a political, or some might say terrorist organization that embraced the use of violence to cause the Serbs to break away from the Austro-Hungarian Empire and join the modern nation of Serbia. Okay, well, where does Franz Ferdinand come into all this, you might ask? Well, Franz Ferdinand was the heir apparent to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And Franz Ferdinand wasn't exactly super popular within the empire. Among other things, Franz Ferdinand believed that the Serbian minority in the empire should be treated as co-equal with the Austrian and Hungarian peoples. He kind of believed in this whole idea of a United States of Austria, or as he put it, a United States of Central Europe, creating a federal structure within the empire. So actually, he was sort of a great fan or patron of the Serbian people, interestingly. But Franz Ferdinand had a weakness, and that is he married, get ready for it, a commoner. He married a commoner by the name of Sophie, and apparently Franz Ferdinand was shunned for his indiscretion. Franz Ferdinand was probably a pretty terrible person otherwise, if you look at his writings and views, but he seemed to have been genuinely head over heels for his wife. And every chance he got, he wanted to parade around with her, to show her off to the public, to make the people of the empire and the Austrian imperial court fall in love with her, which might be the reason why he wanted to go on an official visit to the Austro-Hungarian province of Bosnia. Now, Bosnia was to the Austro-Hungarian Empire as Northern Ireland, or let's say Ireland during this time period, was to the British Empire. In other words, it was a hotbed of separatism within the empire and political friction, and that's putting it mildly. And to top it all off, Franz Ferdinand decides he wants to go to parade through the city of Sarajevo during the Serb Holy Week. I've heard some people analogize this to, it would be as if the King of England wanting to parade through the city of Dublin in St. Patrick's Day. Or a more modern equivalent would be to say, it would be almost as if Osama bin Laden wants to parade through New York City on July 4th. Like, you can't imagine a more insensitive or, bizarre idea, but that's Franz Ferdinand for you. Again, he wanted to demonstrate that he was the heir and that he wanted to demonstrate that status along with the love of his life, Sophie. So he goes to Sarajevo, and at this point, everybody is telling him it's a bad idea. I mean, you don't have to be a psychic or just somebody with a really good sense of foreshadowing to understand that this is not going to end well. And the thing is that on the day of July 28th, Franz Ferdinand suffers not just one assassination attempt. Apparently, there's a bomb thrown into Franz Ferdinand's motorcade, and it simply explodes behind Franz Ferdinand's car. And apparently, Franz Ferdinand is just annoyed at this inconvenience. He dresses down the mayor of Sarajevo and says, this is how you treat Austro-Hungarian royalty. But when push comes to shove, when he's asked if he would, like to cancel the rest of his schedule for that day, Franz Ferdinand's like, nah, dog, let's just keep going. And so apparently in one of those earlier confrontations, a young Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip has the opportunity to shoot Franz Ferdinand as his motorcade is passing. But apparently he loses his nerve at the last minute. Now, Gavrilo Princip, this young Serbian member of the Black Hand, walks off to a sandwich shop at a deserted alleyway in the capital of Sarajevo, and he begins to kind of kick himself because he knows that he'll never get another opportunity like that. But then he looks up, sort of into the alley, and he sees a car that has gotten stuck. It's trying to turn around, but he then recognizes the two passengers in the vehicle. And as luck would have it, at least luck for Gavrilo, right? It was Franz Ferdinand and his wife, Sophie. And at that point, Princip opens fire and kills them both. And the collective reaction of Europe was me. I mean, it's a personal tragedy, especially for Franz Ferdinand, and it certainly doesn't make things any better for the ailing Austro-Hungarian Empire. But in the grand scheme of things, the reaction was pretty muted, believe it or not. To explain why Europe goes to war, we need to factor in a few other things. So, to look at the reasons for World War I, you need to look at, the main reasons. No, that's not funny. And, this acronym, I'm pretty convinced, is almost as old as the First World War itself. I'm not sure it really does it justice, hence the optional video I'm going to make. But basically, the idea is that militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism all contribute to the eruption of hostilities in 1914. And the argument is that Franz Ferdinand's assassination alone can explain why Europe goes to war, because if it weren't for these other reasons, realistically, Europe probably would not have gone to war, at least maybe not to that extent. So militarism is fairly straightforward. It's something that we kind of talked a little bit about during the Spanish-American War to a certain extent, where a new generation of Europeans are looking at war as maybe something that's enviable, or at the very least as a chance to prove their individual worth as human beings, and also just the idea that war is increasingly seen as a way to right wrongs, as a way to advance long-term policy goals, whether that's to obtain additional territory, whether that's to unify society a bit more. And the argument is that this atmosphere of militarism becomes so pervasive in Europe that people increasingly begin to see war as a solution to what ails people. And you see an arms race that breaks out throughout Europe as armies get larger and larger, as military technology increases. And of course, that's something that we see across the Gilded Age during this time period, that we see the expansion of industrial technology. And the thing is that there is a trickle-down effect into military applications. So that, along with this sort of contradictory and confusing network of alliances, increases tensions quite a bit. During this time period, let me go ahead and go forward, you basically have two alliance blocks. There were the Central Powers, and they consisted of the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. If you want to take a look, they are the countries sort of seen here in purple. Then you also have the Entente Cordiale, or, you'll probably hear me refer to them as the Allies, which consist of the British, the French, the Russians, and the Italians. And eventually, by the way, spoiler, circa 1917, the United States as well. That being said, these alliance blocks weren't crystal clear when Franz Ferdinand was actually assassinated. Because let's just say that there were certain countries that were tied very closely with one another, but then you kind of had countries that were floaters that could sort of move between both groups. So, for example, both the Germans, the Austrians, and the Italians were part of what was called the Triple Alliance. But the thing is that the Italians didn't take that alliance very seriously and were more than willing to side with the Allies for the right price. So the thing is that alliances contribute to the outbreak of war, but the thing is that in a perfect world, alliances are actually meant to deter war. But the issue is, and this is something that we'll talk about towards the end of the war when we get to Versailles, is that alliances are only effective if they're clear and everyone is sure what all the major participants are going to do. So, for example, Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire are super close, but Italy is just not feeling it. And so, because of the fact that we're not really sure who Italy is going to side with in the event of a major war, arguably that makes war a little more uncertain. Instead of deterring war, it just leads to a very long and complicated decision tree. So, for example, France and Russia were very close. They have a very military alliance that dates that really sort of emerges during the late 19th century. But technically, Britain is also a member of the Entente Cordiale. They have a few treaties signed with the French, but nobody is really sure what the British are going to do if France declares war on anybody, or if somebody declares war on France, actually. Maybe the British will help the French out. Maybe they won't. Nobody really knows. And when you get that sense of uncertainty throw that sense of uncertainty into the mix, then your alliances don't really deter war. They just make the war, when it actually erupts, a lot bigger, arguably, than it has to be. The other explanation is that the competition for imperial territories, especially in Africa and Asia, is what makes war more likely. And we've seen that the United States is actually sort of a part of this problem in its war against Spain, but this is not just an American problem. You have emerging powers that are trying to acquire overseas territory and possessions at very often the expense of other powers. So, for example, Japan has been eyeing overseas territories in the Pacific. And you also have the fact that Italy, which is only unified in the 1870s, is increasingly looking to expand its empire at the expense of the declining Ottoman Empire. We've also seen that the British and the Germans are experiencing competition for overseas territories throughout the world. And so arguably, the fact that you have potential flashpoints, not just in Europe, but throughout the world, make conflict much more likely. But arguably, the most powerful causal explanation for the outbreak of World War I is also the most powerful causal force in European history during the 19th century. And that is, as we've already kind of discussed, the emergence of nationalism. The idea that people who share certain cultural traits in common, most notably language, should also share a nation state. Now, this idea was antithetical to the makeup of the European nation-state system. That if you were to look at European states in the modern era, in other words, really from the 1500s onward, most of those nation-states were organized not on the basis of nationality, but on the basis that they shared a certain dynasty in common. For example, if you were to look at the British Empire, the British Empire wasn't like a traditional nation state. The Scots, the Irish, the Welsh, and the English all had very different cultures and national histories. Realistically, the Act of Union didn't unify them on the basis of a shared culture. It's not because people there shared very much in common. It's because now, going forward, they were going to share the same dynasty. And if you were to look at, for example, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was a multinational empire, as we've already discussed. But throughout the 19th century, we've seen successive waves of revolutionary movements in which countries unify or break up on the basis of some shared national identity. Germany, which was never a unified nation state, suddenly unifies in 1871, or 1870 to 1871, in the Franco-Prussian War. Italy goes through a very similar transformational process around the same time period, circa the 1850s and 1860s. And so we're seeing the map of Europe redrawn because of nationalism. And the outbreak of nationalism in Europe becomes a destabilizing force. It ultimately is kind of what leads to the elimination of Franz Ferdinand, but it also kind of helps explain the reaction after the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. So, the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians had a fairly close political alliance. Now, the analogy that I use for Austria-Hungary is that Austria-Hungary is kind of like insert senile great-grandparent here. Senile great-grandparent who decides that even though they just hit a pedestrian yesterday, they still want to, drive their car wherever they want. The thing is that as great powers decline, they can become kind of sensitive about the fact that they're declining. Now, on the other hand, Germany was a very strong power. Germany, as soon as it sort of unifies in the Franco-Prussian War, actually displaces Britain as the most industrialized country in Europe, and it's also Europe's greatest military power. So, Austria-Hungary has a protector in Imperial Germany. And so when Franz Ferdinand is assassinated, Germany extends to the Austro-Hungarian government something that is called the blank check. Now, it's easy to kind of misinterpret the blank check. The blank check is a diplomatic telegram sent by Kaiser Wilhelm II to the Austro-Hungarian government, in which it's basically made clear that Germany would, quote, back the Austro-Hungarian Empire up to the hilt. In other words, Germany is kind of supporting the empire come what may. But it's a little bit more than that, because Germany is also kind of saying that Austria is its friend. And an attack on Austria is an attack on Germany. And Kaiser Wilhelm also kind of suggests that nobody attacks him. So if attacking Austria is the same as attacking Germany, Germany's not going to let that slide. And so Kaiser Wilhelm II encourages the Austro-Hungarian government to stand firm against Serbian aggression. Now, here's where it gets a little confusing, because you have the Serbian country, the Serbian nation, here. It's probably behind my portrait, here-ish. But you also have the Serbian people, and not all Serbs are in Serbia, right? You have Serbian minorities scattered throughout the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now, what the Austro-Hungarian government does, though, is it holds the nation-state of Serbia responsible for the assassination of Gavrilo Princip. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand. It's not a perfect analogy, but it's kind of similar to how the United States holds the Taliban government of Afghanistan responsible for the September 11th attacks. Now, I think that's probably a little bit more of a clear-cut case, actually, but The fact is that the Black Hand, the Serbian nationalist organization that assassinates Franz Ferdinand, it did have connections with Serbian intelligence organizations. The question, though, is how much the Serbian government knew what its own intelligence or secret service organizations were actually doing. And as far as I understand, that's still kind of an open question. But regardless, the Austro-Hungarian Empire held Serbia responsible for the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. And it basically spelled out this list of demands that were fairly extraordinary. If Serbia adhered to all of those demands, among other things, it would give Austro-Hungarian troops the ability to censor Serbian textbooks. It would basically surrender a lot of Serbian sovereignty over to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. You almost get the impression that the Austro-Hungarian Empire is pretty mad. Or at least that's the impression that Serbia got, which is why Serbia agreed to all of those demands. The only reservation that it made is that it would like to negotiate on a few of those demands for clarification. But to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, that wasn't good enough. And those equivocations, those requests for additional negotiation, did not constitute acceptance. And so the Austro-Hungarian Empire declares war on Serbia. Now, at this point, that does not a world war make. At this point, we have the Austro-Serbian War of 1914. But this is where the alliances thing comes into it. So, and also where nationalism is important, because Serbia is a Slavic country, which means that it has a language that can be classified as Slavic. Basically, the analogy is that French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, and Romanian are Romantic languages. Well, Serbian is a Slavic language, and Russian is a Slavic language. And this is a little Russian history, but basically over the last 30 or so years, the Russian Empire had emphasized that it was the protector of all Slavic peoples like the Serbs. Now, Serbia was picked on in sort of a diplomatic dispute between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. And Russia, for its part, was utterly humiliated at the result, where Serbia actually had to give up some territory to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And Russia was not going to let that happen again. So when the Austro-Hungarian Empire declares war on Serbia, Russia reciprocates with its own declaration of war. That brings Germany into the mix. And at this point, we have a war between Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire on one side, and Serbia and Russia on the other. But the issue is that France and Russia have a military alliance that begins to develop as soon as France is defeated during the Franco-Prussian War. During the Franco-Prussian War, Germany unifies into a nation state in order to defend itself against perceived French aggression. The Germans score a surprising upset victory over Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew, Napoleon III. And as a consequence, not only does Germany unify and become the German Empire, but also a piece of French territory is taken away called Alsace-Lorraine. Now, this was a sticking point for the French, because apparently this was perceived as a great national embarrassment. Outside of the National Assembly in Paris, which is basically like the equivalent of their Capitol building, they have statues that represent all the provinces of France. And from 1871 until the First World War, there was a black drape placed over the statue that was supposed to symbolize Alsace-Lorraine. And France basically focuses all its efforts and energy from 1871 to 1914 on a way to get even. And now that Russia had declared war on Germany and Austria-Hungary, now it looked like the best opportunity. But France doesn't move quite yet. And so this puts the Germans in kind of a bind. Because the Germans are like, well, if we send all our forces to deal with the Russians, and the Russians have a bigger population than us, a bigger army on paper than us, we're going to have to send troops there to contain them. And if we do that, that's going to leave us vulnerable to a French invasion. So what do you do there? Because now it looks like that Germany is going to have to fight a two-front war, which you don't have to be Napoleon Bonaparte to realize that that is no good. In Imperial Germany, the German General Staff realized that this was kind of a problem, and they explored ways of quickly making a two-front war, should it come, a one-front war. But that's easier said than done. The German General Staff was a very competent organization that tried to make war as scientific as possible. So the German General Staff realized that Russia was just so big that you couldn't knock it out very quickly. Its army was very large, but mostly untrained, and the Russians didn't have a lot of heavy weapons. But on the other hand, there were very few railroads in Russia, and so it was going to be impossible to really bring in large quantities of troops to take major cities like St. Petersburg or Moscow. And of course, that Napoleon Bonaparte fellow also had trouble successfully invading and knocking Russia out of another war. So then, if you can't knock Russia out, then the question is, can you knock France out? France is a little bit more complicated because it has a much better army and an army that can mobilize quickly, but theoretically, it's not as far to Paris as it is to St. Petersburg or Moscow. So theoretically, Germany could achieve a knockout blow against the French before it could achieve a knockout blow against the Russians. So the issue, though, is that if you look at a map, it's pretty obvious where the Germans are going to have to attack if they want to really hurt the French. They're going to have to attack along the Rhine River, because that is where Germany's border with France extends during this time period. And so if you're France, well, all that really means is that you just have to basically pile your troops along the Rhine River and wait for the Germans to kind of come across and mow them all down, right? Well, the Germans realize that, and so they decide that they're going to do something a little different. During the turn of the century, a German general by the name of Count Alfred von Schlieffen comes up with something humbly titled the Schlieffen Plan. The Schlieffen Plan basically envisions the German army just simply holding the Russian frontier and bringing every spare soldier to the Western Front on its border with France. Now, that being said, instead of attacking across the Rhine River, here you basically go through the back door and attacking here and attack Paris in the very flat northeastern regions of France. I mean, it makes sense. Like, you're able to basically ninja your way into Paris. The French don't expect it. Like, it's a win-win, right? Well, there's only one small problem, and that is the fact that in order for this to happen, you have to march through the neutral country of Belgium. Now, okay, I know what you guys are thinking. You know, the Belgians have an imposing army. They're a military superpower. Said nobody ever. That's all true. But just like the Serbs have a protector in Russia and the Austrians have a protector in Germany, the Belgians also have a protector of their own, and that is, of course, the British Empire. Now, Britain had basically stayed out of European diplomacy for most of, if we're being honest, the 19th century, but the emergence of Imperial Germany kind of alarmed it. And also, it had a treaty with the Belgians guaranteeing Belgian and Dutch neutrality that dated all the way back to the 1830s. Now, the Germans didn't really think very much of that treaty to begin with. They didn't think that the British would risk war with Germany over Belgium. But what happens is that as the German army mobilizes and they march through Belgium, they run into some problems. First, the fact that the Belgians don't surrender instantaneously. They actually put up a really decent fight. That's problem one. Problem two is they run smack dab into the British Army that shows up very, very quickly and actually starts beating the Germans at the Battle of Mons. Now, what happens, though, is that as this plan is getting carried out, the Germans are able to start to push through. The Germans have a monopoly on heavy artillery, and in the early part of the First World War, the Germans also just outnumber the Allies considerably. The Germans come within just a few dozen miles of Paris. They actually get to this point right here, and that is where you have the Miracle of the Marne. There's not very many battles during the First World War that you need to know, but during the first battle of the Marne, the British and the French launch a counterattack which basically blunts the German advance. And at that point, the Germans don't have a plan B. This one, roll of the dice was basically the only thing that guaranteed them a military victory. And so what happens is that in confusion, the Germans have to retreat to a more defensible area of territory in northeastern France. But throughout basically the entire First World War, the Germans will occupy all of Belgium. And also, by the way, this area of France, for those of you who don't know, is the most industrialized part of France. So it also means that the French are going to have to launch a series of very bloody offensives to basically take France's or retake France's equivalent of Detroit. So after the Battle of the Marne, the Germans retreat and the Allies pursue them to this point right here. And this is where World War I sort of takes on the imagery that we're familiar with today, and that is trench warfare. This is where we learn that maybe the greatest weapon of the 20th century isn't the machine gun, but the shovel. So, military strategy and tactics 101. Attack your enemy where they are at their weakest, not their strongest. And try to do that, by the way, by maybe moving around the enemy, moving around what's called the flanks or the sides of the enemy, rather than, kind of charging up the middle directly towards your opponent. Well, that all sounds well and good, but here's the problem posed by the First World War. From the English Channel and the North Sea all the way to the Swiss border was a continuous line of fortifications, armies, and defensive positions. There's no flank to turn. There's no way around those lines. You can maybe try to launch campaigns in other parts of the world, and that's tried without very much success. Just look at Gallipoli, by the way. And so the only thing that seems to work, air quotes, is to try to charge headlong across no man's land and to push the enemy back. Now, as it happens, the Germans and the Central Powers in general don't have the numbers that the Allies do. And so they mostly adopt a defensive position for the war as the French are trying to regain their lost territory. But a typical offensive basically consists of rushing across no man's land, this period between two parallel systems of trenches, in which, as troops rush across that, usually muddy, and shell-pocked terrain, they were usually hit by artillery fire, machine gun fire, and they also had to evade obstacles like barbed wire. In some cases, the soil was so broken up by artillery fire that we have cases of people just sinking into mud and disappearing, just drowning. And by the way, if for the small numbers of troops that were left in these early assaults, they then had to actually storm into trenches and displace defenders, and then also be able to withstand counterattacks. So, as you can imagine, it's a very bloody, horrific experience. Another way that you can kind of conceptualize this is imagine football, where instead of a normal field, the field is two yards wide, and instead of a normal team roster, you have teams with 200 people on either side. So if you have a very visual image at this point, you understand that you can't have a running game. The only thing you can do is rush over the enemy. And that explains the goal of the First World War, where the only way one side could actually gain an advantage is by eliminating large numbers of enemy soldiers. And by the way, this is why the First World War is generally seen as such a horrific conflict, because most of the time you don't win wars by just trying to kill the enemy. Killing can be a means to an end, but usually the idea is that you take an enemy capital, you take valuable real estate that the enemy needs. Whereas in the First World War, that's just not really a possibility. And so the object is that instead of taking territory, you take lives. And the result is battles like the Somme or Verdun, where battles last for days, weeks, and months on end. If you look at the Battle of the Somme, which is maybe the most famous, pointless World War I battle in the Anglo-American tradition, the British lose something like 794,000 people killed, wounded, and captured. The Germans lose about 500,000. And by the way, what's even more shocking is that the Battle of the Somme was in itself just a distraction from, or like a feint, from an even larger battle, the Battle of Verdun, in which the Germans and the French were slaughtering each other in comparable numbers. So some of the bloodiest battles in world history are associated with the First World War. And we associate these battles as being battles in which hundreds of thousands of people are killed or wounded without much gain one way or the other. If we look at the First World War, we also see yet another example of the principle that we brought up again and again in this course, which is that if you ask human beings to devote themselves to the task of killing other human beings, we can be depressingly and surprisingly innovative. And if you look at the very beginning of the First World War, French troops, most famously, are basically charging out in almost Napoleonic uniforms. They're charging out in bright red pants called Les Pantalons Rouges. During the early part of the war, really before the war, it was, there were questions as to whether or not, maybe bright red pants were a little conspicuous to like machine gun fire and all that. And it was, the conclusion was that Les Pantalons Rouges, the bright red pants, were a vital part of French national morale, and so they were kept. But not for very long, because as we see, the First World War accelerates military technology and technology in general quite significantly. The machine gun existed before the First World War, but it comes into its own during the conflict, where a single machine gun crew could potentially mow down entire companies or battalions of troops. Also, as a way to beat the stalemate of trench warfare, we have the tank, which is used by both sides, but specifically the British, or especially the British. And the idea of the tank is you basically build an armored tractor that can crush obstacles like barbed wire and clear the way for advancing infantry. Now, if you want to clear the advancing infantry, though, you also have poisonous gas, like mustard gas, that can be used to wipe out thousands of troops at once. Both sides use it throughout the conflict, and we'll come back to how the use of poisonous gas becomes kind of like part of the symbology of the First World War. Now, also, airplanes come into their own. Before the First World War, airplanes were kind of quaint, novel inventions, but airplanes were used at first to scout out enemy positions, and then at one point, a Japanese pilot, interestingly, fighting or scouting German positions in New Guinea, decides that instead of waving to his German counterpart, he's going to whip out his pistol and fire pot shots at his German opponent, and it actually manages to score a hit and downs the German aircraft. That starts an arms race, and by the end of the First World War, obviously we have the emergence of dogfighting with combat aces like the Red Baron that are associated with the First World War. But for U.S. history, and especially for explaining why the United States joins the First World War to begin with, we have to look at another piece of technology that we associate with the First World War. And it's not a piece of technology that's used to break the stalemate on land, but instead it's used to win a war at sea. Next time, we'll talk about the Unterseeboten, or U-boat, and its role in bringing America into the First World War. Until next time.